headquarters.
Welcome back. I'm joined now with Ashley Shelton of the Power Coalition. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad. Thank you for having me.
And you have a lot of great insight looking back. It's been a week now since the general election, a month since the primary election, and we saw almost record low voter turnout. And I want to hear a little bit about why you think that is.
What we're seeing is the power of poverty, right? You know, folks often forget that Louisiana is the second poorest state in the country, but we are. And I think that people, feel divorced from, the power of their voice and their vote, even though we have done, and we've seen the power of their voice and their vote so many times over the last several years. And I think that, we saw it kind of play out both 2 years after COVID. And the realities of, how many people went without the things that they needed. And, and so I always get frustrated when people talk about crime and this explosion of crime divorced from 2 years of COVID and at least a full year without, any dollars getting to the ground from the federal government outside of the stimulus, checks that people initially received. We saw a lot of folks just really hurting, and then we see their kids really hurting, right? And so we see all of these outward expressions of it, but we don't want to connect the dots. And I think we have to be, accountable and connect the dots that there are a lot of people that are hurting in the state of Louisiana, and they just don't see how government's going to make it better. And then I think a worse reality is that you also had a lot of folks that are just working. I stopped at the grocery store on election day during the primary, and I reminded a couple of folks to vote, and everybody says, "Oh, I have to go to work. I'm at work," or "I have a second shift." And so the realities of how poverty plays out in our state is real.
The government needs to gain trust of its voters again. So how do we really change that amidst all of the poverty and these challenges that so many people are facing?
I think that, we've done it before, right? I mean, Louisiana's re-enfranchised formerly incarcerated people. We have ended the racist practice of non-unanimous juries. We have done really hard things. We've had criminal justice reform that, took us out of being the most incarcerated place in the world for a very short time, but certainly allowed us to at least see, some small wins there that mattered to certainly people of color in this state. And so we know we can do it, right? And we know that those wins have been deeply felt in community, but I think that we've got to do more of it, right? That we've got to the wins and the change has to feel less incremental. And I think that's going to be hard in this environment, right? I think if we're talking about banning books and, and don't say gay and the culture wars and all these other things, that sound like political rhetoric of other places. Well, I keep reminding folks, we can't afford to be Florida. I mean, and so it's I get it. I'm not going to argue with people about their political ideology, but what I do know is what makes sense in Louisiana and what makes sense for its people. And so I think that that's where people have to stand in their power, right? And they have to remember, that, again, we can't, we can't sit back. We have to engage. And as we see whatever the leadership of this, this new governor and this new legislature, what lays ahead, where their voices within that. And so I think, again, for Power Coalition, there's some definite wins that we're excited about. We have a pathway to a second majority-minority congressional district. And we know we've been able to engage and have, thousands of folks excited about that process. And so our work as we look at 2024 is really to continue to get deep into community and talk to folks.
A lot of people may feel that Louisiana has become such a hard red state, especially with the supermajority of the state legislature. And there's a lot of speculation of how Landry was able to pull out a win in October, because maybe some felt that they didn't identify with Sean Wilson, or maybe they felt that Landry was just so powerful there was no way that their vote would count. So how do you kind of counteract that thinking? Do we need to have better candidates? Do we need to have more voter get out the vote? How would you want to tackle that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a couple of things. I mean, I think, one, it's people feeling like they can have an impact, right? And I think that the rhetoric around the statewide election was very strong, so much so that people did feel kind of defeated in the process. And also too, I mean, I think that, like in terms of like the energy that usually comes with an election season of any kind, like there it just wasn't there either. So like there wasn't this, this unavoidable, conversation, this unavoidable, energy, ads on the TV, ads in newspapers, on the radio. Like it wasn't that didn't exist in the same ways in which it's existed before. And I think it goes to a point that you mentioned it before around competition, right? Like we saw so many of our, House members and others go unchallenged, right? Like so almost half of the legislature went unchallenged this time, much like, unlike 2019, only because of term limits, but much like all of the other cycles before it, right? And so we have work to do to make sure that we are building leadership and that and that people can see themselves as viable candidates, so that when there's more competition, it forces more energy, right? And so that's one thing, more of a drumbeat around where folks are engaging in a question, in the questions of like which leader is going to represent us best, right?
While many people may not want to start looking to the next set of elections, we do have the presidential primary coming up in the spring. And how can Louisiana really play a big role in 2024? You already talked about the potential of getting a second majority minority district that's working its way through the courts right now. So what needs to be done to get more folks into the ballot box come next November?
So, we're going to get into community. I mean, I think that that's the biggest thing. I mean, we know that listening works, right? We know that when we listen to community and can solve problems using policy, both at the local, state, and federal level, that it reconnects people in a way that that matters to them, and it reconnects them in a way that they can touch, see, and feel. And so that is a lot of the work. We saw the power of people to really fight for this second minority district at the congressional level. And now it's time for those voters to stand in that power and to elect candidates of choice. And so we're going to, certainly be expanding our team and working across the state to really listen to, and talk to voters about why they stayed home, like what was driving that feeling that they didn't have power, that their voice and their vote didn't matter. And so we're really going to dig deep and try to understand, and also try to bring to bear some places where we can have multiple conversations across the state about, well, what are your elected leaders doing for you, and what would you like for them to do, so that we can also get back to a place where we're talking about accountability instead of just having all of this happen to feel like it's just happening to us, right?
Well, Ashley Shelton with the Power Coalition, I really appreciate all that insight and thank you for coming on today.